talk a little bit about normal teen and tween development and how it's impacted also by having a kid with a bleeding disorder and how that changed things a little bit. I did one on 0 to 10 before, and so that information I think is out there. You guys should be able to access that recording if you weren't able to make it and you have a child that age you want to know about. But this is focusing on our wonderful tweens and teens. We're going to talk a little bit about what is the goal, the developmental goal for kids this age. What does brain development look like, which I think is really fascinating. We're going to talk a bit about temperament and personality, sleep, some general positive parenting strategies for this age, how to prevent problems, and then when you have some common problems, how to deal with them, and specifically what to do when you have a kid with a bleeding disorder with some of the issues that tend to come up with them, which are usually around adherence. And we'll talk about some resources. So what's important to recognize when you have a kid who's this age is that their developmental goal is to become independent of their family of origin, i.e. their parents, i.e. you. The plan for them, and their biology is driving this, is that over the next, from the time they're early teenagers, over the next 10 to 15 years, they need to form a new social group, a new family, and become independent of you. And one of the ways that they are doing that is by forming that social group, and they experiment with that a lot. Those social groups change a lot. Developing an identity of who they are, both as part of your family and as their own individual person. And they experiment a bit with that by trying on a lot of different hats. And what I mean by that is that, they're going to come home one day and announce that they have a sudden interest. They might say, I want to shave my head, or I want to dye my hair blue, or I want piercings, or I want to buy a guitar and I'm going to become a musician, or I want to skateboard. Whatever it is that they get into, they're going to be trying those on and seeing how they fit for a while. Oh, this is also when kids often come home and say, I want to be a vegetarian, if the family's not vegetarian. This is them trying on their identity, figure out what's important to them, and how they're going to want to have their own family at some point in the future. And just because they try on a hat for a while doesn't mean that they're going to keep that hat on forever. It may be a phase, it may not be. But the whole point of this point is to try until you find the right one that fits. So what's important to recognize is that what happens over time is that infants, they're all about what they can touch, taste, see, smell, and feel. The young child around 5 is able to use symbols like words, but doesn't have logical reasoning yet. That's the 3-year-old who tells you, I want a banana, but I don't want it to have a peel. That's, a child who's able to communicate using symbols, but isn't able to think logically. When kids hit around 8, 7, they can think logically about concrete objects, and they can understand conversations, but what they can't do is reason abstractly and think in hypothetical terms. And that's what an adolescent can do that younger children cannot do. However, they're not great at it, as we'll talk about. So the stages of adolescence, there's a few of them, even in, we think of this all as being a monolith, the teen years, but they're really not. The reason we have now this new word tween, it's not so new, but reasonably new concept, is that puberty really does begin before a child turns 13. The onset of puberty is about 10 and a half for girls. And what I mean by that is not necessarily getting period. That's one stage of a girl's puberty, but the beginning of the whole process begins around 10 and a half for boys and around 12 and a half for girls. That's average, but you can have a year or two in either direction and still be in the normal range. So there's a lot that's happening during that year, though that early onset of puberty is where you see a lot of physical changes. And the parents still have a lot of influence over their kids in that stage. Around 14 to 16, they want more independence from their parents. There's more conflict, and they focus more on their relationships with their friends and possibly forming a romantic bond with somebody. In the late teen stage, they are still having some conflict with their parents. They're still focused on their friends and relationships. And they start to make major life decisions about career, work, schooling. And you really want a child, an adolescent, to have good self-esteem during this time so they make good decisions during that time. The brain is changing a lot. We used to think that the human brain was pretty much done forming by the age of 5. We now know that actually you're 90% done forming by the age of 5, which is pretty incredible if you believe it. But that there's still that last 10% is incredibly, incredibly important in terms of particularly the areas that are involved. So generally, the cortex over the layer around the whole brain is becoming more complex, more efficient, more specialized as time goes on. So you see here the 5-year-old, and you see as we move forward in adolescence, that you get to at the age of 20, you finally have full development in those frontal lobes. And those are areas that are important for planning, problem solving, paying attention, shifting and controlling your behaviors and emotions. So, what you have here is at the onset of adolescent, you have a fully formed brain in a lot of ways, but it still is deficient in terms of how well it does in terms of planning, emotional control, and problem solving. So, in many ways, it's like a race car that doesn't have the brakes working quite yet. The so this when you think about it from a brain perspective, this talks a bit about why adolescents are really prone to high risk behavior. The first reason is that prefrontal cortex I talked about. That's the brakes, and it's not fully formed in those teenagers. What is fully formed and is actually maybe a little hotter than it's going to end up to be is the amygdala, which is the fear center of your brain, the emotional center of your brain. So adults don't rely on the amygdala that much. We try to keep our emotions, not, I don't want to say in check, but we manage them. We manage our emotional responses. Teens really don't have much practice doing that. They're relying on the amygdala, and therefore they're more impulsive and more emotional, boys and girls. The parietal lobe continues to develop until the early 20s. And in the teens, it doesn't process information very effectively. So that's responsible for a lot of spatial reasoning, some language. And then the reward center isn't fully developed. So they're more excited by reward than consequence. So again, with teenagers, they're thinking more about the rewards than they are about what the potential consequences would be. And you can see how that would lead to a lot of risky behavior. So their friends say to them, "Hey, do you want to sneak out of the house and come to this party with us?" They don't, their brain, where their brain first goes is, that sounds like a lot of fun and maybe I can see my crush there, as opposed to, I'm going to get caught and I'm going to be in huge trouble. And then what's really interesting is that the hippocampus is actually, this is one area of the brain that functions better in teenagers than it does in adults. So, teenagers, the hippocampus, which is really where memories are laid down, it's kind of like the memory factory of the brain, that is just working at full production speed in teenagers. And that's why they're able to learn so fast. And this is both a good thing and a bad thing. In adults, the hippocampus loses some neurons as we get older. We don't learn quite as quickly as a teenager does. So, because of all of those brain areas that I just went through, adolescent brains are extremely sensitive to stressors. They're sensitive to biological stressors, they're sensitive to mass events like war, disasters, and pandemics. And they're very sensitive to social stressors. So, this is a window of opportunity, and it's also a window where things can start to go wrong. So, what can happen is you can have some positive spirals where you have a stressor, you cope with it well, you learn from it, you take responsibilities, you have healthy versions of risk taking. This leads to good outcomes, you get more self confident, and you take supportive risks. When you have negative consequences, there's you can have a negative trajectory where you have certain things that can really end up causing a negative spiral for you between biology and environment. So an example of a negative spiral is that the biological changes at puberty lead to a tendency to want to stay up later. Then technology, they can be texting with their friends late at night. Late bedtimes and erratic sleep provide kind of like a social jet lag. And those problematic patterns of behavior mean that you don't get up for school on time, you're late, your grades suffer, and then your grade suffering starts to affect your emotions, your attention, your health. All of those things can get negatively impacted by that lack of sleep. So that's an example of a downward trajectory. So you have to have that support to create those positive spirals. And so, for example, in the sleep, as parents, we can really be involved in making sure that that's a priority so that they don't lead to that it doesn't lead to negative spirals. So we talked about how teenage brains are still developing. And by the way, they're not done till humans are about 25 to 27 years old. So it's not just the teenage years, it's the early 20s as well, in terms of that frontal lobe development. Teenage brains, this is all the hippocampus and some of the risk taking, they're primed to seek and take new experiences. This helps them leave home as young adults, which they are supposed to do, but it can make them vulnerable to some risky behaviors. And then there's additional risk in terms of certain behaviors. So you start using addictive substances during your teen years, you're 6.5 times as likely to end up with a substance abuse disorder as compared to those who start using after 21. And that's usually really more biological. The good news about the teenage brain is that they're designed to learn new behaviors. They're inherently flexible. So that can be really, really helpful in terms of recovery if any bad things develop. So it's important to remember, and I hope you see it from the brain, that teenagers are not adults. They're missing some critical skills, but parents often overestimate the ability of kids this age to make good decisions. Um, Teens are capable of abstract reasoning, but they struggle with impulsivity and regulating their emotions and behaviors. And it's important, I think, to understand all of this and then also to explain it to your teenager and have that be something that your teenager understands as well. That will help them do something called metacognition, which is thinking about their own thinking and say, is this really a rational decision I'm making here, or am I being impulsive in this moment? That's actually how we learn to become less impulsive. Okay, so there's some pretty significant gender differences. Boys and girls generally cope differently. Now, of course, there's overlap, and there's some kids who don't fit into this pattern. There's no question about that. And some kids who don't fit clearly into different genders. But in general, all psychology seems to agree that girls tend to be more talkative and argumentative, especially with their mothers, and boys tend to retreat and isolate themselves a bit. That's a pretty typical gender difference. Okay, so for sleep, adolescents continue to need 8 to 10 hours a night. Um, on average, they're getting around 6. So that's a big problem, is that America's adolescents were very chronically sleep deprived. That is bad because the purpose of sleep, we didn't really understand it until about the last decade. Why do we sleep? Why, as a species, do we sleep? Different species sleep different amounts. Why do we sleep the amount we do? Well, what's interesting is we sleep a bit more than most animals of our size. The waste products are actually cleared out of the brain during sleep. And it's because we do so much learning that we have so many waste products in our brain, and we do so much changing and so much development. So that sleep is very, very important in order. So especially during adolescence and childhood, when you are building, you're building new architecture in your brain, you can't do that well if there's a bunch of junk clogging up the works. So sleep deprivation in teenagers is really strongly linked to developing mental health disorders like anxiety or depression. It's linked to academic problems, addiction, suicide, car accidents, and actually even health problems, such as diabetes, obesity, heart disease later in life. So sleep is very important. So you're thinking, well, then why don't they just sleep? They're staying up late. Nothing really changed, but it is actually the child that changed into an adolescent. So sleep onset delay is biologically hardwired in teenagers. What that means is that when the hormones hit, a kid who used to be able to fall asleep at 9 o'clock is not going to be able to fall asleep until 10 or 11 o'clock. The ideal schedule for teenagers biologically is 11 p.m. to about 8 or 9 a.m. But we have a problem. High school starts at I mean, it's different everywhere, but high school starts at 7:20 where I live. And it's not uncommon that kids have to be on the bus at 6 o'clock in the morning. That choice is usually made because teenagers are able to get themselves ready more independently than elementary school students. And so they start first. But it's exactly the opposite of what their brain needs. The elementary kids are able to wake up earlier than the teenagers. Also, there's a lot of time pressure on teenagers in general. They're very busy. They have packed schedules. There's a lot of pressure to fit in all this stuff to get into college. They might have jobs. Electronic devices also make it harder. And then in addition, their kids don't have very good sleep hygiene. And what I mean by that is they tend to have their phones in bed with them. They tend to drink caffeine in the afternoons because they're so tired, because they're so sleep deprived, and all of this makes sleep harder. So sleep hygiene is a really important thing during the teen years, and it's very, very challenging. Do we have any questions about sleep before I move on to something else? You can also save your questions to the end, and that's fine. But if you have any questions about sleep, I'm very happy to answer them at this time. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is temperament. Temperament, I think, is really, really interesting because it is important to think about the temperament of your teen as they develop through these years. And temperament is the biologically hardwired way of interacting with the world that every child is born with. And this is really interesting. It's cross cultural, they find it all over. And there are 9 dimensions: activity level, which I think is self explanatory, rhythmicity, how rhythmic are their cycles in terms of how structured are they in terms of sleep and eating, all of those kinds of things. Distractibility, approach withdrawal, which is like kind of what is their response to a new object? Do they run toward the new thing? Do they have any fear of something new? Or do they tend to hang back a little bit? Adaptability is how well they adapt to changes. Attention span and persistence is how much time will they devote to an activity. Intensity of reaction is the energy of the response. So some people have very, very small, they get happy a little bit, they get small a little bit. Some people have huge highs and huge lows. How much does it take to respond, threshold of responsiveness, and general quality of mood. Some people are born with just a more friendly, joyful affect, and some are just a bit more negative. So why is that important? Because you put these kind of temperament dimensions together, and there's 4 different types. There's the easy child, pretty happy, regular biological rhythms, accepts new situations easily. There's the difficult child, that's about 10%. There's the slow to warm up child. I had 2 of those. That was interesting. And then there's the uncategorized. So, I mean, these are not perfect. So why are we talking about this? We're talking about this because temperament is what's underneath. It's kind of like the first layer of the building. And over time, the personality will develop. Personality is not the same as temperament, and personality is not stable until you're about 30. A lot of what forms your personality is how your temperament interacts with your environment during adolescence. So it's certainly not the whole thing, they're still your 20s, but while that brain is developing, a lot of this is what ends up in your personality. Okay, so you want to think again about those temperament and the brain vulnerabilities and how those interact with the environment to form the person who is going to be there when your child's all grown up. Okay.
Dr. Bloom.
Yes.
This is Heather. There was a question about how much sleep a new middle schooler needs.
Yeah, so I have one of those. My son just turned 12. He's in the 6th grade. There is individual variation. So between 9 and 10 hours would be about typical for that age. But there are some kids who just need more sleep just genetically, and there's some kids who just need a bit less sleep genetically. I will say that my 6th grader has, even though he has started puberty, he has not hit the sleep delay onset yet. And I'm not looking forward to it. It doesn't always happen until high school, maybe 8th grade. But it can happen earlier. But so far, we're doing okay on the sleep over here. I hope you're doing okay on the sleep over there. It gets more challenging when they get a bit older. Ways to prevent some mood and behavior problems with teenagers and all kids, really. You want to think about how is the teenager contributing to the household and to their life. And even though it seems like, wait, they can barely hold their head above water and you're asking them to give something back, this is actually really important for them. It's associated with all sorts of important milestones, associated with all sorts of positive feelings about themselves, self-esteem, self-efficacy, self-forgiveness, is participating in chores around the house, and if they're old enough, a part-time job, even a minimum wage job, is incredibly good for your child's self-esteem and self-efficacy and resiliency. The other thing is you want to give them positive feedback as much as you can about things that they're doing well. If they achieve a new level of independence, you want to take notice of it and to give them a, instead of berating them for it, like, oh, you're finally making your lunch yourself, or you finally remember to get all your equipment together for sports practice, say, I am so proud of you that you've managed to figure out how to handle that and stay on top of it. That is a great job. On that note, you want to give them as much independence as they can handle because they're craving it biologically. You don't want to give them too much. You want to understand that it's going to be a process, step by step, that they might need your help at first. But you also don't want, if you think it's something they're capable of, nothing will motivate them to do a good job as much as natural consequences. So if it's your deal with your kid that they're going to remember their stuff for sports practice and they forget and they text you, can you please bring this to me? Can you please bring this to me? My suggestion is to give them one free pass a semester, because we all need some grace sometimes, but then no more. That's it. So after that, they're going to have to experience the natural consequences of not having remembered to do what they need to do, because you don't want them to rely on you. Now, these rules might be different if you have a child with some special needs, like some ADHD, but in general, you want to find that line between, hey, give them the independence, and make them have some natural consequences. Natural consequences are really important during middle school. Everyone understands that middle schoolers are figuring it out. By the time they get to high school, things start counting a bit more. So I advise you to do as much independence work as you can while they're still in middle school. The other thing that's really great in terms of talking to teens and tweens is to talk to them about emotions, talk to them about feelings, validate their feelings, but don't try to problem solve. They're trying to figure this out and they need to build these skills. And so if they tell you about a trouble with a friend, first of all, wow, a teenager just opened up to you. That's incredible. You just say, well, it sounds like, that really was very hurtful to you. I can imagine that you're upset. And even though what you want to say is delete that girl's number, she's absolutely mean and vindictive, you just say, it sounds like that wasn't very nice. It sounds like you're upset. And don't try to solve the problem for them. Let them figure it out on their own the best you can. That's the hardest part of parenting an adolescent, is knowing when to step in, and knowing when to try to let them solve their own problems. What I will say is that if there's physical safety involved, of course you have to step in. If there's a situation where they're going to get their feelings hurt, that's when we want to step in, more than even with physical safety, because it's so painful to us as parents when our children are socially rejected. But that is part of the normal developmental process of this age. And sometimes that's what you have to go through in order to get where you need to be. And for them to maybe realize that friend wasn't a good friend, they should move on to a different social group. They have to experience that pain in that process. Another thing is to not make things a battle of wills too much, but to maybe use some humor. So, for example, if your child is lying down on the couch and you're just been cleaning the dishes for an hour, and they say, hey, mom, will you go grab me, can you grab me a cookie? And you really just want to chuck the plate at their head because you've been standing on your feet and they're just lying on the couch. That's where you can use some humor. You can go over and bring them an empty plate and said, I'm so sorry. I'm just so tired that there's no way that I have the strength to physically go get a cookie, but I brought you this plate in hopes that you might be able to do it for yourself. And they will laugh and be like, my mom's so embarrassing. But generally, the humor is a great way to kind of deflect those kinds of situations and let them know that you've set a boundary, that they need to do something for themselves. You're not their servant, but also let them know you're not too mad about them asking. not the end of the world. The other thing is you do need to respect your child as an individual and what's important to them. So while they're trying on those hats, like for example, if you get to the, if you are not a vegetarian household and your child comes home and says that they're a vegetarian, my advice would be to respect that and to try to accommodate it for a period of time and to talk to your child about that choice, talk to their child about how to make that choice in a responsible way for their body and how you can work with it as a family. I would say the same thing if your kid wants to change their hair color, even though I know that's really hard. I always encourage parents to think of it as they're permanent changes and they're not permanent changes. And hair color is not a permanent change, whereas a piercing or a tattoo is. So I'd rather that the energy went into the hair color change, at least at this particular age. Okay, so we talked a bit about sleep hygiene. That's consistent bedtime, not having screens in the room, or at least not on the actual bed. If they have to work at a desk in their room, that's fine, but no phone in bed, no computer in bed. Another thing we did in my house that at the start of the pandemic, which I think was really helpful, was a technology contract. We talked about caring for their technological devices, what the limits of their privacy were, which is pretty much they don't have privacy on their technological devices, at least my kids at the ages that they are. When they get to be later adolescents, they might have some. Another thing I like is if they're out and in a situation where they feel uncomfortable, you can develop a code word where they can just text you that code word and you will come pick them up, no questions asked, and they don't get into trouble. And that's kind of that's like a safety valve, just in case. Still, even as much as you can, try to make time for family dinners because it's a time to connect. It's a time, that everyone comes together and has a conversation. And family dinners are really strongly linked to improved mental health in kids of all ages. And even though I'm sure it feels like your teenager's growing apart from you, try to find a way to connect with them, even if it's something on their level, have fun with them, in some sort of way. My son and I watch a lot of Marvel movies together. It probably wouldn't be like my number one thing, but he's super into it and his dad can't stand them and neither can his sister. And so I've been into that with him. So, he texts me when there's a new something coming out or I want to watch a show with you and that keeps our connection strong. Also, I love this. This is just really fantastic parenting right here. Teenagers are very connected to their devices. It's how they connect to their friends. I would say that they still need to earn that. And don't forget, you have control over the Wi-Fi password. You have control over the cell phone connection. You are paying for these things. And they're privileges. They are not rights. So I love this in terms of, if you want to have Wi-Fi today, empty the dishwasher, fold the laundry, vacuum, take out the trash, whatever it is that it needs to be. We talked about natural consequences. And the other thing is the removal of a privilege. Privileges include your phone. Privileges include spending time with friends socially. Those are the common privileges that, you can do. Timeout does not work at this age. We're past this. So it's usually, kind of a grounding or removing a phone for a period of time. This mom took it to the next level by saying you have to clean the kitchen, text it. So this is during summer break, mom's at work. So this is how she handled it. And I thought that was pretty brilliant. The next thing to remember is that the kids who need the most love will ask for it in the most unloving ways. And this is really, really true. So one thing that we know is that this was before the pandemic. The diagnosis rate of anxiety and depression was skyrocketing then. It's been pretty much a continual linear increase, 5 to 8 times what it was in the 1950s. And so I have to tell you, I wrote this slide before the pandemic. And that's when we had about 15% of kids with some sort of diagnosable mental health condition, a decline in empathy, a rise in narcissism, and we were calling that a mental health crisis. Now we're up to about 40% of kids, 30 to 40% of kids are meeting criteria for some sort of mental health diagnosis in this post-pandemic, or we're still at the end of the pandemic period. So there was just a huge amount of new problems or worsening of an existing problem on teen mental health. And particularly the suicide rate or attempted suicide rate and sometimes successful suicide rate has gone up very high And it's of major concern to all of us who are in child psychology. This is one of the things I'm going to skip over some of this, and we're going to talk a little bit about growth mindset. So, growth mindset is something that's a positive thing that's really important to develop. A growth mindset, the difference between it is that when I'm frustrated, I don't give up. I understand that failure is part of the learning process. That I work hard. I learn from my failures and I try again, having taken that information about what I didn't do right, and then adapting that and challenging it and have a good attitude about things. And a fixed mindset, which many kids have, is, well, I'm either good at it or I'm not. And if I'm not good at it, I don't want to try. They give up when they're frustrated. They don't like to be challenged. These kids are often told that they're smart. And even though it seems like that's a nice thing to say, a nice way to parent, telling your kid that they're smart tells them that there's something inside of them that they cannot change that affects how well they do in the things that they try to do. So, what happens the first time they get to something that is too hard for them? They say, well, I can't do this, therefore I'm not smart. They haven't learned that failure and effort are an important part of the process. So instead of saying, instead of saying to your child, you're smart, you might want to say, you are really great at not giving up. You tried so hard. Ooh, that didn't work, so you tried a different strategy. That was a great idea. And these are some things that they can say to themselves that will help them. We do a lot of this in my house about training your brain. If something is too hard for you, that's okay. It's going to take a while to train your brain how to do this. And that results in a completely different attitude from your kids about things that are hard. One thing that Einstein said, it's not that I'm so smart, it's that I stay with the problems longer. It's that he didn't give up on them the way that others did. Okay, so things that you can say to promote growth mindset for your children is to, what did you really have to work at today? What did you learn about today? You say things like, I like the way you tried all kinds of strategies in that math problem until you got it right. If there's something that your kid really struggles with, you say, we all have different learning curves for different things. It might take you a little longer, but I know you can do it if you keep trying. And you give feedback on the process, like praising effort, creativity, strategies. Don't praise personal characteristics like being smart or pretty or artistic, because that will actually lead to a loss of confidence and resiliency for kids. Okay, so here are some of my absolute favorite books. The one on how to raise an adult, I feel like should be required reading for American parents, because American parents have been very helicoptery and lawnmowery for a while. And then this is one is The Teenage Brain. This is the mindset stuff I was talking about, the growth mindset. This is a great way on just how to talk so teens will listen and listen so teens will talk. Is the teen version of the kid book by the same name, that is really about just how to have effective communication with your teens so they'll open up to you, and so that when you have something to say to them that they will not reject it. And then this is a girl focused book, and this is a bit of a boy focused book because the genders have different challenges at times. Okay, so in terms of parenting a teenager or tween with a bleeding disorder, um, in general, kids with bleeding disorders are more at risk of some health anxiety and medical traumatic stress. Of course, that makes a lot of sense, right? Medical traumatic stress is kind of like post traumatic stress. You have the same core symptoms of re experiencing hyperarousal and avoidance, but you don't necessarily have it at a level of full blown PTSD. It revolves around a medical condition, medical treatments. Of course, you have to pay attention to your child's medical condition and make sure that they are safe and healthy. But the goal is for you to stop doing that because someone takes over your job, and that someone being your teenager takes over the job of worrying about their medical condition and being the one in the driver's seat when it comes to their health. So the concern is that when you have a child who has a health condition, you become overprotective, which can increase their anxiety and lower their self esteem. So, this is a tricky balance as a parent of a child with a medical condition, which I am as well. I have a child with a chronic medical condition, not a bleeding disorder, but a different one, where you have to pay attention to it, but you also don't want to be overprotective and you want to hand the reins over to them the best that you can. So, we talked a little bit about medical traumatic stress. When the kids are young, it actually affects the parents more. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. But when they become adolescents, older kids can definitely experience it as well. Children actually grow into their trauma response. And what I mean by that is that they didn't have the abstract reasoning to understand what was going on when they were 3, 4, 5. They were very focused on the needle stick, for example. But as they get older, they start to realize the impact of their medical condition in a way that you realized it when you had a child who was diagnosed with it. You had your traumatic response at that point. They're actually growing into it slowly over time. And for young kids, that, like I said, they focus on the medical procedures like needle sticks. That's the difficult part. For adolescents, the problem is adherence. Adherence is doing what your medical doctors want you to do. And it's a huge problem in adolescents in general across many medical disorders. And it's a huge problem across patients in general, even when they are adults. So, adherence is really, really important because adherence directly relates to how well the child is going to do medically, physically over their lifespan. So, in terms of the medical traumatic stress, you want to understand it, you want to validate them, you want to have them talk to their providers about this, focus on the parts you can control. But if the traumatic stress is impacting their adherence to their medical regimen, that's where you want to seek professional help. And there's a whole bunch of psychologists whose focus is exactly this, helping with psychological barriers to adherence. Okay. There's other times, so I'm going to skip to this. So, adherence. Non-adherence with any medication can vary from 15 to 93%, with the average around 50%. So it is very common to have poor adherence. Barriers to adherence really relate to the health beliefs that the patient has, but also due to the healthcare system, socioeconomics. Teens in general believe that they're supernatural and they're unbothered by illness and they just want to fit in with their peers. So, for the bleeding disorder community specifically, young adults are at pretty high risk of discontinuing prophylaxis and having poor adherence, especially when they transfer care from pediatric to adult healthcare systems and take over the responsibility for their own medical care. So, we have solutions in terms, and that's really a lot of what HFA is about. And you guys have an incredible gift and such a strong organization that is there to help you because, we talked about how basically teenagers want to be part of a social group and to fit into that social group. And HFA provides a social group of kids with bleeding disorders who they belong to and who they can feel like they can be fully themselves with. So, the bleeding disorder summer camp is a great example of that. So you take this thing that is true in teenagers, which is that they really need to form their own social group, and that's their motivation and their development. And you turn that into, okay, well, here's our social group, a social group of teenagers with bleeding disorders, and here's the peer-to-peer education that we're going to provide for you because they will take it from a kid who's a few years older than them much better than they will take it from a doctor or a nurse or a social worker who is middle-aged. The other thing is that it can be really helpful to deliver this information to teenagers in an electronic delivery on their phone, via text, via apps, as opposed to giving them a handout or having them read a book. This works better for teens, the electronic delivery. And there's nothing wrong with using some financial incentives or if you have to Wi-Fi as an incentive. In general, the process of independence in your healthcare begins at birth and moves very slowly over time. And it's understood that there will be mistakes. The goal is to gradually hand over the reins to your teenager. Like, for example, when you go in for, a visit to the doctor, let the teenager speak first And you might then ask your questions later, or you're more likely, you go say, do you have anything you want to say to the doctor? No. Then you ask your questions. Or you talk to your teenager in the car there about, what questions do you have for the doctor? Well, here's some that I have. Do you want to ask them and have the doctor speak to you? Just gradually move that over. By the end of high school, we want to see that the child should be calling to the level of even making the appointments. The other thing is, there's lots of non-adherent teens out there. Losing your cool is not going to help. Yelling at them about what could happen to them, if they're non-adherent, won't help. That's where you want to seek outside support. That's where you want to talk to, the departmental social worker, or get a list of referral to a psychologist. And remember that if they do have a bleed from non-adherence or from risky behavior, saying I told you so, it may be true, but it's not helpful, because teens are at that point where, look, remember what their brains are looking like. They learn experientially. So the good news is that there are these guidelines, the MASAC guidelines, which I know that Heather is going to send out to everybody. And these are the ages that it's for, and it has categories, these different categories here, and it has goals for your teenagers depending on their age in each of these categories. And the goal is that it gradually transitions the knowledge and caregiving from parents to the teenagers over time. And then the last thing I'll say is that mental health treatment is very commonly needed, both right now in the pandemic and because of kids who have bleeding disorders. If you want support, go ahead and seek it out. If the child's mood or behavior is interfering with treatment, interfering with their school, social, or family life, if the child seems, or the teen seems excessively tired, irritable, or anxious, or just if the siblings or the parents need support and not necessarily the patient. Therapy helps. It helps with these kinds of problems a lot, but don't wait too long. Early intervention is really key, and you can get referrals from your pediatrician or from your hematologist. And a licensed mental health counselor, licensed psychologist are probably the best ways to go. And if there's ever an emergency, I sincerely hope this won't happen, but if there's ever concern about self-harm or harming somebody else, you can call 911, and the police may help, or you can bring your child. My top recommendation above calling 911 would be, if you can, bring your teenager to a local children's emergency room. A children's hospital would be ideal, but if not, an adult hospital is fine. And then here are my references, and I look forward to questions and conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloom. That was such excellent information and really super helpful. I did want to mention that the references that Dr. Bloom mentioned, as well as the books that she cited, are listed on the HFA Symposium website right next to the recording for last week's session. And tomorrow morning, the recording of this session will be up as well. If you're having a hard time finding them, or if you need additional information, you can certainly reach out to HFA, and we can resend you or make those resources available as well. But they are listed on the HFA Symposium website. So don't feel like you have to take a screenshot, because they're out there. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. One of them is, a mom who is saying that it's a difficult transition at this stage. They're starting puberty. They might be moving into a new school environment. What are some strategies that you could share to really help start that gradual transition to independence, knowing that they're already likely to be overwhelmed with stress outside of that?
That you don't have to do this all at one time. That if they're starting a new school and they're starting puberty, that might not be the right time to advance in their independence in other ways. As long as they're always moving forward, then you're doing just great. You want to think of things in phases. So right now, this is that we're adjusting to a new school and a new body phase. When things seem to calm down a little bit, then you can think about, okay, what's our next goal? It's actually one of my criticisms of my husband. He's like, just that my husband has of me is that just when we get to a good place, you're like, okay, what's next? Well, try to stay ahead of the curve a little bit. But yes, also take some time to enjoy the accomplishments. And just remember, you don't have to do everything at once. If you try to get your child to be more independent in their healthcare at a time that they're stressed with other things, you're not going to help yourself. This is why the summer camps that HFA offers and your local organization offers are so important, is because there's not a lot on the kids' plates at that particular time. Academic stressors, social stressors are much more minimized. And so the summers, I would say, would be a really good time to kind of advance in their independence in their healthcare.
Great. Excellent. Please do type any questions that you have into the chat. We have just a couple of more minutes, and I'm sure we can answer one or two more. If there's other questions that people have, that would be great. And again, the presentation will be made available. The recording of the presentation will be made available tomorrow. At the end of this presentation, we will automatically receive an evaluation. The evaluation comes out in your web browser, not on Zoom. So please do look for that, and be sure to add your name if you're interested in being submitted into the drawing, into the raffle. And also, we do have a session that starts at 7 p.m. Eastern. It's Insurance Jeopardy. And you can find the link to that by just going back to the homepage on the symposium website, and you can click right into it. We do have a question that just came in. It says, I'm hoping to get my 15-year-old daughter to start ordering her own factor and supplies. Will this be an issue with insurance?
I don't know the answer to that. What I would say is that why don't you have her do it on speakerphone, and you're right there if you need to.
Yes, I would concur. It shouldn't be an issue, but I would definitely do that. As Dr. Bloom just said, sort of tier it up so that you're not expecting too much too soon and they have a feeling of success.
In general, you just want to scaffold. So it means that the first time that they do something, I mean, they've been watching you do it, and then they do it with you being right there, and then they do it independently. And that's generally the process. So scaffolding and not having them do it all on their own. Like, even if if you're reminding her, hey, it's time to order more factor, you can't expect necessarily that she's going to remember that on her own. But you talk about, oh, we set up calendar alerts and I'll help remind you, and now it's time to make the call. You take it slow so that ideally by the time she's 18, she's got it all well in hand.
That would be great. We have one question left, which is, Dr. Bloom, what if we have, not actually, but according to the older child who is not affected, ignore their feelings in the journey to help the younger child who is affected? How can you rectify the older child's opinion and make them realize we did our best at that time?
There's always going to be sibling rivalry, even if you don't have health conditions involved. To some degree, you've got to be patient. One thing that I might say to the child is going directly to what the hurt is. So it's not uncommon for kids to feel this way when they have an affected sibling with some sort of health condition. I guess, how I would approach that is, I'm really sorry you feel this way. I would not get defensive. I would try not to say things like, we just did our best, or this was a lot for us to handle. Just say, tell me what it is that you feel like you needed that you didn't get, and let me see what I can do to try to help you get that now. And so you've gone right to the hurt by saying that. Tell me what you need. The other thing we say in our family a lot is everyone gets what they need. So as opposed to everyone gets the same, everyone gets what they need. And so there are times that my kid who doesn't have a chronic illness has to sacrifice things for my daughter who does. And, one thing that we'll say if he's getting frustrated about that is that if this were you, we would do the same thing for you. So I might try some of those approaches, but honestly, this is the kind of thing that's probably best worked out in therapy if there's that kind of level of resentment. But it's very common. It does not mean you were bad parents. It's just very common for teenagers to feel this way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloom, for sharing your expertise and your time. As always, you have such a wonderful way of really breaking down such complex information into such understandable and usable advice. So I really super appreciate all the time and expertise. And I would encourage everyone to check out the recording once it's up tomorrow and look at those resources, and certainly be in touch with HFA staff if you have any further questions. Have a
Thank you
good
so much
evening,
for having
everyone.
me. I love this community and being able to help. Thanks so much, everybody.
Have a good night. Thanks.